In order to talk about this problem, we have to talk about kinds of value. There's all different kinds of value. A really rough dichotomy, and one that's very useful, is this dichotomy between intrinsic value and instrumental value. If you want to go down this rabbit hole, there are multiple kinds of intrinsic value and multiple kinds of instrumental value. For our purposes, think of intrinsic value as something having value just on its own, for the sake of itself, having some kind of inherent value that doesn't have to do with its function for something else. Instrumental value is things that are valuable for something else. So things that can be used for something else, things that can be exchanged for something else. And so, the classic example, and for a long time the only example of intrinsic value, was human individuals. The easy example of instrumental value is money. If you are on a desert island with a big pile of money, it would be worthless. It would not have value. It only has value as this transactional thing where you can get something that maybe somewhere down the line actually does have intrinsic value. So the trick, of course, is the natural world. Does the natural world have intrinsic value? We would, I think as conservation biologists, we hope that it does, because in some sense, intrinsic value seems better. It seems more valuable than instrumental value. And a big reason for that I'll talk about in just a minute, and that's that, if you say that something only has instrumental value, then there are surrogates. There are ways that you can get that value not using the thing that you're referring to. Whereas intrinsic value, you can't, we can't replace Doogie Howser. NPH, straight out of Albuquerque, is one of a kind, and the value he has is the same as all other human individuals, but also one of a kind, and so it can't be exchanged. This idea of instrumental value for nature is that, again, there are different ways of thinking about this, but probably the simplest is just that the instrumental value or anthropocentric value of nature is that nature's value derives from its utility for humans. So maybe its utility is economic. You can have a financial value from something in nature. Maybe it's medicinal, the cure for cancer in the rainforest kind of thing. Food value. Obviously, we use nature to get nourishment as humans. Scientific value, we learn about the world by studying nature. Aesthetic, beauty. There's many of us who see, especially in pristine nature, a great beauty that just isn't found in manufactured or created things, human-created things. Recreational value in terms of what we use nature for. And then, transformative value, this idea that, okay, you're in a pristine habitat, a natural habitat, and it just changes how you think about the world, how you think about yourself, how you think about your relationships, things like that. So again, the problem with instrumental value is that you can always come up with something else that fits that bill. Economic value, obviously, there's money. Medicinal value, this idea of the cure for cancer in the rainforest, wouldn't it be more efficient to just put more money into developing cures in the lab? Food, there's a lot of ways to get food that don't depend on nature, natural environments. Scientific value, there's all different ways to learn about the world. Aesthetic value, maybe there are things that are manufactured or created by humans that are as beautiful or more beautiful than the natural world, and so on and so on. So when you have these replacements, it means that, maybe that value isn't really this end in of itself value. It's something that can be, supplied by something else. So here's a concrete example. The silvery minnow, what's the value of that? Some people say, well, the value is that it is some sort of marker for the health of the Rio Grande. Okay. It probably is. But there are other things that are markers of the Rio Grande as well. And if that's the way the silvery minnow gets its value, then we have other ways to do that that don't require us to put a bunch of money into saving the silvery minnow. Other ways to assess the health of the Rio Grande. So let's look at intrinsic value. Is it possible that nature has value for its own sake? And if so, what does that look like? One way to think of it is to think of what kind of qualities do things have that warrant ethical consideration? So when you think of something that has value, and in particular has intrinsic value, what sort of characteristics does it have? And this is a line of thinking that goes into often the deontological approaches to human ethics, and saying that, okay, humans are rational, for example, and there's something about rationality that confers this intrinsic value. Humans have the ability to reason, to think about things, to use logic. Spiders, probably not. Another sort of cutoff point would be sentience. And in particular, so sentience being the ability to feel things, in particular the ability to feel pain. This is a really popular view that stems from Peter Singer and has been adopted by animal rights things. And that's that, individuals that can feel pain are the things that have this intrinsic value. Well, what about having, preferences or needs? And this is one that, people have tried to come at this using nature with ideas like, okay, the plant has a need for water, it prefers water. That's a lot like, you having your free will to want something that you want. Some of those links are pretty tenuous, as you can imagine. And then is there something about just being natural, coming into being without a human creator behind it? Is there something about the Grand Canyon that is more special than Central Park? Beyond that, maybe you look at the Grand Canyon and you think it's prettier. Or maybe one of the reasons you think it's prettier is that it was naturally created, whereas Central Park was, sculpted by humans. Another way to think about environmental value is in terms of the loci, like what kinds of things have value. So now we're not talking about the characteristics as things have, but just like what kinds of things. So individuals, does an individual, that's the way human ethics works, is the idea that individual humans have this intrinsic value. If that's the case, then, well, does that mean that, collectives like species don't have value, or don't have value that's as valuable as the value of individuals? What if we take species as being the thing that has value? Are you talking about all species? Do both koalas and mosquitoes have the same amount of value? It doesn't seem like we treat it that way. And then issues come up with this, right? Like, how do you harm a species? How do you damage it? And then if the species is our focus, then do individuals matter? And this is a big conflict in terms of a lot of conservation approaches. Well, maybe ecosystems are the source or the locus of value there. And there's issues with that. What is an ecosystem? And then are we talking about all ecosystems? Does a rainforest have the same value as a city park or a sewer? Same issue with species. How do you harm a species? How do you harm an ecosystem? You can certainly change it, but how do you harm it? And then if it's an ecosystem, if that's the locus, then, well, what about species and what about individuals? And an important point in this is that, you can't have it all ways. There are cases where our emphasis on the value of one of these kinds of things supersedes our emphasis on others. And so an example of that is, when we talked about crocodilians, right? This is where this is coming around to what I mentioned when we were talking about croc conservation, that, crocodilian conservation is this big success story where we're saving species, and we have this incredible track record of helping all the croc species come back from extinction. But that comes at a cost to individuals. individual crocs are being killed, farmed, skinned. We are here valuing the species over the individual when we take that approach. So intrinsic value for nature is really difficult. I have this here, Holy Grail, because, it really is the Holy Grail for the entire field of environmental ethics. Lots and lots of people have made attempts to come up with a justification for the intrinsic value of nature, of species, of ecosystems. And it's difficult. It's an unsolved problem. It's something that needs more work and might never actually work. But the approaches that have been put forth take the route of some of the ideas that we've just been talking about today. So, for example, this idea that we're expanding our realm of what has value beyond humans. So we say, okay, what is it about humans that gives them intrinsic value? Peter Singer would argue that it's the idea of sentience, the idea that they can feel pain. So if we can come up with other animals that feel pain, then that's our cutoff, and those are the things that we hold to have intrinsic value. So we have to ask ourselves, what kinds of things are like humans in that sense? Another approach that by Kenneth Goodpaster and followed up by several others is that anything that can be harmed or that can have preferences or needs, preferences that can be interfered with. And this is something that is worthy of an intrinsic value. And so this isn't just, not killing something. It's like, preventing the tree from getting its water, that kind of thing. And then, some of the approaches to this are a bit more convoluted, but that's how difficult the problem is. Holmes Ralston is one of the absolute pillars, original architects of environmental ethics, and he has this roundabout justification where, somewhere in there, the fact that you have this evolutionary process producing all these things, that ended up with things that we value, specifically humans, maybe other things, but that, all of the products of that process then have to be valued. Because of the difficulty of those approaches. And, you can hear the skepticism in my voice as I talk about them, and you can do the reading yourself. You'll see the citations in the reading I'm going to give you for today. There's been a kind of come around in environmental philosophy led by Brian Norton and others, and that's that it's just not working to try and ascribe intrinsic value to nature. That's what we want, that's what we wish. We would love to say, you need to save the silvery minnow for its own sake, because, it's sacred and valuable, and it doesn't matter what happens with humans. But it just hasn't been working. The justification just isn't there. And some of these folks, try and come up with arguments that it doesn't matter, that, okay, whether we're treating nature as an intrinsic or not, you still get the same kind of conservation principles. And, the quotes in yellow at the end there, intrinsic value for nature is a flawed theory of value, and it distracts environmental ethicists from other more important issues. The idea that chasing after this red herring, trying to get this holy grail, it hasn't worked and it's not worth it. If we really want conservation to work, we have to, link it up with human needs explicitly and go from there. But of course, you are always going to have conflicts of the kind that, we talked about in particular with crocodilians. We just mentioned again today, the species versus the individual. These are still ethical questions that you are weighing different options and different things that you value. But it's not just individual versus species. There's individual versus science here, right? This is where that compassionate collecting view comes through. Is it worth killing that lizard in order to learn more about lizards? That's a reasonable thought to have. Um, there are conflicts, very clear, bald conflicts between human economics and the needs of non-human species. So, part of the issue with the silvery minnow is the water use in the Southwest, and water is a very precious commodity, and things we do to save the silvery minnow may not allow us as humans to get and use as much water as we want. Still further, ecosystem issues where, also, we want to, we have our economic reasons for, controlling the water. And it's not, and again, this, or as an aside, the desire for more water, it sounds like a noble desire, but it really is just economic, right? If you wanted to spend the money, you could get the water somewhere else. It's about getting the water as cheaply as possible. But, in doing that the way we want to, we're really altering the ecosystem in a way that, changes it drastically. And if you think that's a bad thing, then that's a major ethical issue. So what all these things are getting at is this so-called incommensurability problem, or more precisely, the incomparability problem. And that's that, how do you compare these things? There's no common scale to measure scientific value versus the value of an individual animal, or versus the value of a species. And it's not just not having the same quantitative scale. It goes beyond that, where there just may not be a rational way to choose one versus another. And that's why these issues are important, is that we have to make these choices. You have to decide what to preserve, and you hope that there's some basis for that, and that it's not irrational. But that's a tough one. I hope that we've communicated today. So, just to summarize, this is material that we could do multiple courses on, but I'm just going to keep it concise today, because like I said, I know this is a new and different way of thinking, and I want us to be able to absorb it. We talked about how ethics works for humans as just kind of a setup for talking about how it works for non-humans. Instrumental versus intrinsic value, that was an important thing to take home, and what that distinction is. Different criteria for intrinsic value and different loci of intrinsic value. So how we might think of those things in terms of non-human animals. How people have tried to justify intrinsic value for nature, and then just a bit on environmental ethics in practice. And that was really the part about, how do you choose between this, science and the life of animals? When I apply to get a permit to preserve lizards, they put restrictions on it. They say, I tell them I want 10, and they say, no, you can have 5. Somewhere in there, they're weighing the science that's going to get done versus the life of those animals that would be preserved. All right, let me finish up with some questions. And these are thought questions for you. These are not test questions. This is things that you can look back on the lecture today, and if the lecture was kind of too much and too different, you can look at the reading I'm going to give to you, which is a really nice write-up that I'll talk about in just a minute. But think about, as a conservation biologist, as a biologist, as someone who's interested in animals, what kinds of values should humans find in nature? Does it have to be related to human needs, or is there a way to find intrinsic value in nature? And that leads into this second point: should non-human nature, and then that could be species, it could be individual animals, ecosystems, should be preserved even if that nature doesn't benefit humans, or its benefit is in some way replaceable, if there can be surrogates? So this is the intrinsic value question. And then, so should some but not all kinds of life be preserved? Here, in a practical sense, people would love for disease-carrying mosquitoes to go extinct. Once you accept that, then whatever your system of ethics, it certainly isn't that all life is sacred, right? Because there's some life that we're okay with going extinct, whereas there's other life like monkeys that we just need to do everything we can to keep alive. So how do you draw that line? Why does that make sense? And then in terms of levels of thinking here, what sorts of natural collectives should be preserved? Do we need to focus on the species like the Endangered Species Act does, for example? Or should it be the ecosystem like the national park system does? These are different ways of thinking about this, different points of emphases, and one of the points we've made is that these different approaches can come into conflict, and they will come into conflict. And so how do you choose? In the case of crocodilians, is that a flawless triumph, or does something need to be done differently so that fewer individual crocs are being killed? That's stuff that you have to consider if you're going to be a conservation things that you should consider if you're going to be a conservation biologist. All right, here's your reading. I will post this. It's a fantastic introduction to this field. It's really well done. These people, Claire Palmer, Kate McShane, and Ronald Sandler, are all active environmental ethicists doing really good work. And this is just a great intro written for people like us who have some biological background, but maybe not necessarily a philosophical background. I think you should read this whole paper. In terms of what you have to know in a testing sense from today, I think if you can really understand that intrinsic versus instrumental distinction and how it applies to the natural world, that would be great. That doesn't mean, go and memorize definitions. It means, be able to understand that distinction when, you're given an example. Is this intrinsic value? Is this talking about intrinsic value? Is it talking about instrumental value? Something like that. But anyway, so hopefully you've enjoyed today's departure from our usual way of biological thinking. I hope that you will continue to think about these issues as you go forward in biology, and I would look forward to talking with any of you about any of these issues in the future.